Welcome to VCSP Tech Hub. My name is Pieter Vreken, and in this video we are going to talk about managing Veeam Cloud Connect replication network resources. In this video we're going to discuss the following components: hardware plans, networks, VLANs, Veeam Network Extension Appliance or NEA, VMware NSX Edge Service Gateway or ESG, and infrastructure, VMware vSphere, VMware Cloud Director, and Microsoft Hyper-V. First, let's have a look at VMware vSphere and Microsoft Hyper-V. In a vSphere or Hyper-V environment, these are the following items that we need to do. First of all, we need to go to the service provider side and specify the amount of networks, whether they are internal or networks that can have internet access. Then we also need to specify VLAN ID ranges on the cluster or host that we are going to use. We also need to configure a Veeam Network Extension Appliance. We also need to allocate public IP address ranges or single IP address for full site failover. Next, we need to switch to the tenant side, configure the Veeam Network Extension Appliance there, and have a look at the configuration for each network, which is under the setting Manage Gateways. To expose the service provider's resources to tenants, the service provider must first configure the Veeam Cloud Connect replication infrastructure. So here we have a high-level architectural overview, and the infrastructure includes the following components. On the right side, we see the service provider infrastructure, which has a backup server, one or more cloud gateways, network extension appliances, one accelerators optionally, and of course VMware Hyper-V hosts or clusters. On the tenant side, we have a backup server, we have network extension appliances, and optionally the one accelerator. Now, next to the actual infrastructure, we also need to create one or more hardware plans. The hardware plan is a set of resources that the service provider allocates in their Veeam Cloud Connect infrastructure to set up a target for tenant VM replicas. For a tenant, a hardware plan appears just as a cloud host. A tenant can utilize a cloud host as a regular target host to perform VM replication and failover tasks. This set of resources consists out of CPU, RAM, storage, network, so these are the VLANs that we will need to configure in the infrastructure, and all of these together will be the hardware plan and is completely configured by the service provider. To enable communication between production VMs at the tenant side and VM replicas on the cloud host or at the service provider side, Veeam Backup and Replication uses Network Extension Appliances, or in short, NEAs. This NEA is a Linux-based virtual machine and is created on the virtualization host where the tenant VMs and the replicas reside. It's used to preserve communication between the running virtual machines, regardless of their location. This will become more clear later when we talk about partial failover. Again, this is an optional component because you can always choose to arrange the networking side yourself. At the tenant side, the Network Extension Appliance is deployed on the virtualization host where the production virtual machines reside. The Network Extension Appliance is assigned an IP address from the tenant's production network, and it is placed into the selected folder and resource pool created on the ESXi host, or if it's a Hyper-V host, it will be the selected folder. Important here to know is that only the NEA is used to perform partial failover. Stop. Important to know is that the NEA is only used to perform partial site failover. Stop. Important to know is that the NEA at the tenant side is only used to perform partial site failover. Also, one NEA must be deployed for every production IP network. As you can see on the screenshot, we have for this tenant, for example, 2 networks. So it means that for each network, we will need to deploy a network extension appliance. At the service provider side, the NEA is deployed on the virtualization host that acts as a replication target. The NEA is assigned an IP address from the service provider production network and is placed in the cloud_connect_replication folder and resource pool on the ESXi host, or a dedicated folder on the Hyper-V host. Important to know here is that one NEA gets one virtual network adapter per network or per VLAN set in the hardware plan, right? So a customer gets one NEA per network, whereas at the service provider side, the NEA will have one NIC added per network defined. All right, so this is a big difference. With partial site failover, no failover plan is used. The tenant initiates failover for one or more VMs manually. First, the NEAs are powered up. So first at the service provider, then the tenant ones. Then OpenVPN and Proxy ARP are started on each appliance. And then all the traffic from the tenant will be encapsulated in these individual VPN tunnels. So for example, the middle virtual machine has a problem, it goes offline, we initiate the failover manually, then the NEA at the service provider is booted up, then the NEA or NEAs at the tenant side are booted up as well, OpenVPN and Proxy ARP are started, and the result is that we get a layer 2 over a layer 3 VPN connection. And all the traffic can just flow from left to right as if they were in the same network. If the entire tenant production site becomes unavailable, the tenant can perform full site failover. In this scenario, all critical VMs fail over to their replicas on the cloud host one by one or as a group as defined in the failover plan. However, some considerations here are that only the service provider NEA is used, right? Because the customer's side, tenant side is down. There is nothing to be used there. So only the service provider side is used. What we need to create and configure in advance are the failover plan, very important, because otherwise how are we going to start it up? And we need to create NAT rules, so the port forwarding, and also firewall rules, right? So these things we need to create in advance. Otherwise, we cannot perform full site failover. So the steps are, we start the cloud failover plan. The virtual machine replicas are processed in order. They are reverted to the specified restore point. And then the NEA at the service provider is booted up. and of course configure it as a gateway for all the networks, or an internet gateway for the networks that require network or internet access. And here will also the NATing rules and firewall rules, etc. be applied. Now, let's look a bit deeper at that. Regarding the incoming traffic, the tenant is assigned one or more public IPs. The tenant creates mapping rules in advance in the failover plan. So you need to set source IP and the source port to the target public IP and the port. During the failover, the network extension appliance sets the public IP or public IPs on its external interface and enables the destination NAT rules to reach the replica VMs. So this way, the traffic can come from outside to the virtual machines running at the service provider. Regarding the outgoing traffic from the service provider back to the internet, the service provider specifies which networks should have access to the internet. So this is specified in advance. And the network appliance will act as a default gateway for the tenant networks. And any VM running on an internet network is allowed to send packets to the outside. So for this to happen, we need to create a source NAT rule. Probably good to know is that the cloud gateway needs port 6180 open on TCP and UDP. You can close UDP if you do not want to use partial failover. Also, remember to set in advance the tenant side and the provider side network extension appliance root password, because then it just makes it easier to manage them. Otherwise, you need to go to a knowledge base article and find out how you can retrieve the password. Also, the layer 2 tunnel only allows unicast packets. So this means that a DHCP server at the DR side will not be reachable from the customer clients, right, from the VMs. Also, the tenant can perform partial site failover only for VMs with a static IP address. Makes sense. If they don't have a static IP address, then how are we going to reach them, right? Because the IP changes. There is no way for us to set the port forwarding to an IP we don't know yet. Now let's jump into a quick demo and go through the network settings for VMware vSphere and Microsoft Hyper-V. So, what are we going to look at first? Well, first we will jump to the service provider side and we will have a look at the regular Veeam Cloud Connect replication tenant, which is the tenant for vSphere and Hyper-V. We will have a look at the hardware plan, which needs to be created in advance. We'll have to configure the service provider network appliance. Then we will jump to the client side, add the service provider, create a replication job or walk through a replication job, and create the failover plan for full site failover. So let's jump into the lab. So here we have arrived on the Cloud Connect side, so we're at the service provider side. So the first thing that we need to do is go to Cloud Connect and then go and create a hardware plan. The hardware plan is located under Replica Resources. So the reason why we need to create the hardware plan first is because later in the tenant wizard, we need to select which hardware plan we are going to use. And if it doesn't exist, we cannot select it and continue. So first of all, we need to go here. So I've already created one here. Let's just jump into a new one. Create a new hardware plan. This could be any of your standards, could be gold, bronze, silver, or a dedicated hardware plan for your customer. Next, we need to specify the host or cluster where we are going to store the tenant replicas. So for example, in my case, I have a cluster with 2 hosts, right? This is exactly the same on the Hyper-V side, right? We just specify a host or a cluster. Click OK. And I can specify how many resources we would like to give. For example, I want to give 10 gigahertz and I want to give 32 gigabytes of RAM, for example, right? In this case, well, my cluster is limited to this amount of gigahertz and memory, so it doesn't really matter in this case. You can also specify unlimited. Next, we need to specify the storage. So here we can make multiple names for storages. So we could have a fast storage, slow storage, tier 0, tier 1, tier 2, anything you want to name it. So for example, we can pick a type of storage. So depending on the storage policies that you have available. So you could have, for example, an encrypted one, right? Or in this case, just go with a simple vSAN. I can set a tenant quota, for example, just to put in a number, and I could call it premium SSD or just SSD, or you name it, you can put it here. So let's name this. Next, we need to go to network. So network means specify the number of networks we are going to need for internet access and specify the number of networks that are going to be internal, so that do not require internet access. The total number of networks available to the tenant cannot exceed 9. This has to do with the fact that we create multiple networks or multiple NICs on the same network extension appliance, right? And it can maximum have 9 NICs in this case. So we could specify that we need 1 internet access, we maybe need 1 internal network, right? Okay, you can just set it here already. Then you need to configure the VLAN ID. So the VLAN ID range is something you need to configure on your physical switches. So this is again something that you will have to do in advance. So in my case, I've already picked the host or cluster, this cluster. I have picked this VDS switch in my case and specified the VLANs that I'm going to use for internet access and without internet access. And this can be used for more than 1 client, because the hardware plan can also be reused for multiple clients. So once you have configured this, again, don't forget to create these VLANs on the physical switches. Okay. Once you're done here, you can go and click apply and the hardware plan will be created. In my case, we'll just continue with the one we already have here. Next, we go to the tenant. So here it is the tenant. Then let's us walk through an existing tenant. So for example, stop. Next, we need to go and create a tenant. So under tenants, we can right click and then say standalone account. Now let's edit an existing one. So we can walk through the wizard of the existing one, has a username, has a password, and we need to select Replication Resources Cloud Host because we are going to offer disaster recovery as a service. Click Next. We can specify optional settings regarding bandwidth. Next. And here we need to specify what resources we are going to use. So we need to add the hardware plan, right? So select the hardware plan. Optionally, if you have one accelerators available, you can also offer those because they can also be used in combination with replication. And then we will see this is the hardware plan. It has this data stores. It has this amount of networks, etc. Next, we have the managed network settings. So again, we could have a look at the VLAN configuration and whether we want to use the network extension capability. So are we going to deploy the NEAs, the network extension appliances, for partial and full site failover or not? As you can see below here, if you are already using some kind of networking third-party solution, NSX Edge, right, which will be covered in the VCD video, but you already set up, let's say, a VPN tunnel, you can also skip this, right? Then you need to configure the networking part 100% yourself. In this case, we will use the Veeam network extension capabilities. So let's go next. Then we need to create a network extension appliance. So here we can go and change the configuration. Veeam will give it a default name. We change the name, for example, to something more readable. We need to specify the network on which this NEA is going to be connected so that we can have internet access, for example, right? So we specify this network. And we need to put in the IP addresses, or if you're using DHCP, automatic works fine as well. Next, allocate the number of public IP addresses. We can say one or multiple ones, depending on how many your customer needs. And you can here see the amount of IP addresses. So under the public IP addresses assignment, we can add individual IP addresses, or we can also add ranges. Imagine the customer has a fixed /28, for example, then they can use that. So you can assign it here. And then once the customer starts replicating, the tenant name will appear right there. So then we can say apply, finish, and basically at the service provider, we will be done. If we then go and have a look at the service provider infrastructure, we will have our cluster. There will be created the Cloud Connect replication, and under the resource pool of the customer with the customer's name, we will find the network extension appliance with the public network to access the internet, and also with the internal networks where the virtual machines will be connected. And as you can see, these networks have automatically been allocated because in my case, I have already run the replication job. So if I click on it, you can see that it picked a VLAN ID from the range that I specified. Also, the ports are not used, right? So it's not occupied. It's only used when the replicas are actually running, right? So again, don't forget to create these VLAN IDs in advance. Perfect. Next, we need to switch to the tenant side. So let's go to the customer's VBR server. We go to backup infrastructure. We go to service providers, and there we need to add the service provider. In this case, we will walk through the existing one. We give in the DNS name, the port, next, validate certificate, username and password. It will connect to the service provider, resolve the resources that we have available to us as a customer, and now as a customer, we will see the hardware plan here, the amount of resources, IP addresses available to us. Next, we're going to set up the network extension appliance because at the tenant side, we also need the tenant NEA. and we also need to configure it. So it needs to have a host where this virtual machine can live, a resource pool or a folder, data store, and a network. So in this case, this NEA is going to live in this specific network, and we give it an IP address. Perfect. When we click apply, the wizard will be completed. And if we then go and have a look at the customer's virtual infrastructure, we will see that the NEA has been deployed in this cluster on this host. And there it is. And it's connected to the network that we have specified. Of course, it's powered off because it will only be used in the case of partial failover. Next, we need to set up a replication job. So let's go back to our backup server, go to the replication job, create one. Let's specify the network mapping for disaster recovery. Next, and here I can pick a virtual machine. Let's just pick one. Next. And we need to specify the host or cluster at the DR site. So in this case, it will be a cloud host, because regular vSphere in this case, or Hyper-V will mean locally at the customer. So cloud host, there I will see the service provider and I will see the hardware plan to which I'm going to replicate. I can specify this, it will resolve the data stores available. If there are multiple data stores, you will see them here in the list and then you can pick the one that you want. Next is the network. We can use the network mapping because we probably have different networks at the source and at the disaster recovery site. So let's say that in this case, we want to map the web server network to the one at the service provider, which is the one with internet. We click OK, and now the virtual machine, when we fail over the machine, it will be updated with the correct network. Basically, that's it for the network configuration. Further than that, the standard replica settings apply. So pick what is required, next, finish. Once the job has run, you will find the replica under replicas ready. And then you can see here that this virtual machine has been replicated. It's of type cloud. It's ready. And it sits there on my hardware plan Gold, which is the one that we have at the service provider. So the last step we need to do at the client side is create a failover plan. Because if we're going to do partial failover, this will be done from here. But if we're going to do a failover plan, if we're going to do a full site failover better, then we are going to need a failover plan, because that one will be synchronized to the service provider and be launched from there, since our infrastructure at the client will not be available anymore. So we need to create the failover plan. So we can click failover plan and then specify the one Cloud Connect vSphere or Cloud Connect Hyper-V when available. So let's go through the existing one. We give it a name. We specify the virtual machines, the replicas that we want to boot up. Then we specify the default gateways. We can set the network configuration here per network and set the default gateway, the subnet masks, because the network extension appliance will take place as the default gateway for that network. We can also say if we have multiple networks to route the traffic between these networks, so that a VM in this network can access the VM in that network, right? So that can be done by specifying this checkbox. Next, we need to configure the public IP address mapping and the ports. So we need to set the rules here. For example, on this replica, this VM, I have this public IP address available to me, and I want to forward this port to this internal IP address, also on the same port or a different port, depending on how everything is configured. So in this example, we're forwarding HTTP and HTTPS to this machine from the public IP address, right, to the internal IP address of the VM. And that concludes our demo. So let's jump into the next part. Now let's look at how the network configuration is with VMware Cloud Director, or in short, VCD. Service providers who have deployed VCD in their infrastructure can expose VCD resources as cloud hosts for tenant VM replicas. This allows service providers to offer disaster recovery as a service without the need to deploy additional VMware vSphere hosts in their virtual infrastructure. To support replication of tenant VMs to VCD, Veeam Backup and Replication does not introduce additional Veeam Cloud Connect infrastructure components. Service provider does not need to configure cloud replication resources, such as hardware plans or VLANs. So that's quite easy, right? Instead, the service provider configures everything directly in VCD and provides a tenant with access to these resources. The service provider allocates one or more organization VDCs, virtual data centers, to an organization. Each organization VDC provides CPU, RAM, storage, and networking resources for tenant VM replicas. So you could see the VDC as kind of the same as the hardware plan when it comes to Hyper-V and VMware vSphere. As we just mentioned, first we need to configure the service provider side. So we need to set up a VMware Cloud Director organization. In this organization, we need to configure a virtual data center, a VDC, and then we need to set up the NSX edge networking, right? Which is kind of the same as the Veeam NEA, which is provided, or we can also use the Veeam NEA instead. Yeah. Then we create networks in advance, because this is quite a difference with the other situation in vSphere and in Hyper-V. There the networks can be automatically created, while here you need to create all the networks in advance. Also, you need to allocate public IP addresses and ranges. You need to configure this in advance. And then we need to go to Veeam Cloud Connect, and we need to add a tenant of the type vCloud. Right, so this is going to be our VCD tenant, linking the VCD infrastructure to Cloud Connect, so that the tenant can start sending the replicas. On the tenant side, we need to go to the backup infrastructure, connect the service provider, and we need to set up the networking connectivity for the partial site failover, in case this is required, in case this is going to be used. You can also choose to not offer partial site failover and only use full site failover. Then this can of course be skipped. Just as a quick comparison, let's have a quick recap on how we manage the resources in Hyper-V, vSphere, versus how we manage them in VMware Cloud Director. As you can see, in the case of VCD, everything is configured in VCD. So that makes it much easier, right? It's only one place to go to. On top of that, we have predefined allocation models, which can be used as different offerings for your customer, right? To reserve resources or fully reserve resources or just pay as you go. Then on the networking side, in NSXV, we use the underlying VXLAN encapsulation, right, which stop. Then on the networking side, in NSXV, we use the underlying VXLAN encapsulation, while in NSXT, Geneve is used. Again, this is all managed from VCD, not Veeam Cloud Connect. So this is completely transparent for us. The big difference is with the gateways or the layer 3 networking and above, whereas with Hyper-V and vSphere, we can leverage the provided Veeam NEA. In VCD, we can also leverage the NSX Edge, which is provided by NSXV and provided by NSXT. An advantage of the Edge is that it gives you access to many more extra services, and they can all be configured by the tenant. When it comes to partial failover, there's actually 3 scenarios for enabling communication between production VMs at the tenant side and VM replicas located in VCD at the service provider side. So we could use an NSX Edge, we could use IPsec VPN tunnel, or we could use the Veeam Network Extension Appliance. So we have 3 options here, right? So we could deploy the Edge, means we deploy an Edge at the service provider side, we deploy an Edge at the client side, and then we make them talk to each other and all the traffic runs over it. When using an IPsec VPN connection, this scenario, the service provider configures the IPsec VPN connection between the tenant side and the service provider side. This can be all performed in VCD. So this scenario does not require additional actions in Veeam Cloud Connect, neither does NSX Edge. This can be even completely out of VCD. Now, when it comes to partial site failover, there are 3 scenarios for enabling communication between production VMs at the tenant side and VM replicas located in VCD at the service provider side. We can use NSX edges, we can use an IPsec VPN tunnel, or we can use the Veeam Network Extension Appliance. When we're using the NSX Edge, in this scenario, the service providers deploy an NSX Edge gateway at the service provider side and at the tenant side, and configures the NSX Edge gateways in VCD. Right? This does not require any additional actions in Veeam Cloud Connect. The same is actually for the VPN tunnel. Right? This can be completely configured outside of Veeam Cloud Connect. When using the Veeam Network Extension Appliances, in this case, the service provider will not use VCD resources to enable network access to tenant VM replicas. Instead, the service provider and the tenant will deploy network extension appliances on their sites in the similar way as in the regular scenario for Veeam Cloud Connect replication. Now, also to note is that when using the Veeam NEA, you should use isolated VCD networks and not routed networks. And you should disable the DHCP option, right? Because all the virtual machines need to have static IP addresses. Then, full site failover. In contrast to the regular full site failover process in Hyper-V and vSphere, full site failover to VM replicas in VCD does not involve usage of the service provider network extension appliance. So no Veeam NEAs are involved in this case. To allow tenant VM replicas to be accessed over the internet, of course, the service provider must configure an NSX Edge gateway in VCD. This operation must be performed in advance before the tenant or the service provider starts the full site failover operation. Yeah. So quick recap. What do we need to create in advance? We need to create the NSX edge and we need to configure it. We need to also set up the routed network or routed networks that we are going to use for our replicas. We need to set up the firewall rules so that the traffic can go in, can go out. We need to set up the NAT rules so that in case you, for example, have a web server running there, that this one can be reached from the internet and also the traffic can return to the internet. And not to forget, we need to create a failover plan, because without a failover plan, we cannot start full site failover, right? So this is again the plan where we need to set up all the virtual machines in which order they should be started, right? So the steps in this case is when full site failover is initiated, we start the cloud failover plan at the service provider side. The VM replicas are processed in the configured order, are reverted to the specified restore point, and that's it. Because all of the networking needs to be already in place in advance, configured by the service provider. Now let's jump into a quick demo and go through the network settings for VMware Cloud Director. So what are we going to look at in this demo? First of all, we will jump to the service provider side, and this is the place where we are going to do most of the work, because we need to set up the entire VCD tenant. We need to create an organization. We need to create an organization VDC. And then we have a whole bunch of networking to set up, right? We have the NSX edge. We need to set up the networks itself, the public IP addresses, firewall rules, NAT rules. So this is where we're going to spend most of the time. Then we're going to jump back to the client side where we will add the service provider, do the network configuration, set up the replication job, do the network mapping, and then create a failover plan. So without further ado, let's jump into the lab. So when we have a look at the service provider side, we log into vCloud Director, and first thing we need to do is create an organization. So we give it a name, we give it a full name again, because these two fields are required, and then we have our organization. There we go. Next thing is create the organization VDC. So we need to set all the resources, right? So we need to give it a name. We need to specify the organization where we are going to use it. Select the provider VDC, the allocation model, for example, pay as you go. Then the pool, the amount of resources being used, storage policies, the network pool. So this is something that needs to be created already in advance, right? So once you have set up NSXT and added it to vCloud Director, this is something that you need to create first, because otherwise you will already get stuck in creating the organization VDC. And then we say next. So once the organization VDC is created, we have it right here. So then what else can we do, right? So just as I mentioned, this is the network pool, something that needs to be created in advance. So this just exposes NSXT and the transport zone that we are going to use for this. And we will allow our tenants to use this, right? So if I click on organization VDCs, and we can see which of the tenants are using this network pool. Great. Also, something we need to configure is a tier 0 gateway. So the tier 0 gateways are being used for external access, right? So via the NSX edges of the service provider. So this will allow us to have external access to the internet. So here we have created a tier 0 gateway for our tenant. So for example, if we go through it, we specify the NSXT manager, we give the name of the router, we specify the single tier 0 router, right? So that one must originate on the selected NSXT manager. So it needs to exist already in NSXT. This is already pre-configured, right? So we select it, go through it, and then it will appear in here. So then we can use it. Perfect. And then we have the edge gateways, right? Which is the, let's say, the network configuration for our client. So the gateway for our client, which will run as a kind of virtual router on the service provider's NSX edges. This configuration can be done from the service provider side, so from this screen, or it can also be done from the client side, right? So let's have a look at it from the client side. So let's go to the organization VDC that we will be using and open it in the tenant portal. There we go. We can already see that we have replicated into it, but we will never be able to access this virtual machine without setting up proper networking. So we need to set up the edge. So if we go through the wizard here, we can give it a name. Next, we specify the tier 0 gateway that was created in NSXT. Next, we specify the edge cluster we would like to use. And here we also specify the allocated IP. So this will be the public IP addresses that we are going to allocate to our client. So the client's virtual machines can be made reachable, for example, over this IP range, and then we will have to net it to the proper virtual machines. So once we have set this up, the edge is created. You can see the configuration, and then we need to create the network. So we need to set up a new network. We say, okay, use it into the current virtual data center. We create a routed network. So in case you are not going to use NSX edges, you can use the isolated type, right? In that case, we can use the Veeam NEAs. But in this case, we are going to use the NSX edges, so we will use a routed network. We specify the connection, so the edge connection that we just created. Specify here the name. We have to specify a gateway, right? For example, something that I made up, a static pool of IP addresses in this range that we can use, DNS server suffix, and we're good to go. So in my case, I've created a network for the web servers, and this is the subnet. It will be routed to this edge gateway. Perfect. So are we done? Almost. So we have set up the networking more or less, but the virtual machine will not be reachable yet. So first of all, we need to go and configure the edge. So we click on the edge, and then we go to the NAT services. So here we can set the source NAT and the destination NAT rules in order for our virtual machines and our applications better to be reachable on that public IP address, be NAT translated on the correct port to the internal IP address and port. And then we also need to set up a source NAT rule for this traffic to be able to flow back to the internet, right? So don't forget to set up these rules. Also, if you have configured this, maybe it will not work yet, because firewall by default, when you create the edge, denies all the traffic. So you might need to go in here and set the traffic to allow, right? So make it as secure as you can on this part. Also, if you are using an NSX edge on this side, but for example, at the customer side, you could use an NSX edge, but you could also just set up an IPsec tunnel with the existing infrastructure that the client has. Then this is also an option. You can create an IPsec VPN tunnel here directly from the client to the NSX edge, and then it will show up here, right? So you just need to look at the statistics. You will see tunnel is up. This is a local subnet, peer subnet, etc. So this is also an option, yeah? NSX to NSX or IPsec to, well, IPsec on the NSX edge in this case, right? So for the vCloud part, we are done. So now we need to go into Veeam Cloud Connect and create a vCloud tenant and link it to this organization and its VDC. So let's go to the Veeam Cloud Connect server, and then we will go to tenants. So we click on tenants, and for example, here I already have created one. So you will select vCloud Director account, and you would choose the organization and the VDC. So for example, here you will select the organization. In my case, I can't re-edit because I've already added it. So let's just reopen it here. We say replica resources, obviously. We go next. It will retrieve the VDC organizations. Next, replica resources become available. It shows me the available VDCs. And I can even show here to use the Veeam NEAs if I want to use it for partial or full site failover, right? In this case, we are not going to use it. Otherwise, the configuration is exactly as in the previous demo and presentation for vSphere and Hyper-V, right? So that's it. We have added our tenant. So this is only, let's say, linking Veeam Cloud Connect to our organization VDC into vCloud Director. Now we need to put virtual machines in it. So let's go to the customer side. And on the customer side, again, we need to go to backup infrastructure. We need to go to service providers and add the service provider. So I've already added this, so we'll just go through the wizard. It will verify. We put in the tenant account and the username that you have specified as a user in vCloud Director. Apply. It will try to make a connection to the service provider. It will resolve and show the organization VDC available to me with all the capabilities, CPU, memory, storage, one accelerator, and we click apply and we're done. Then we can go and create a replication job. So we can specify here the network mapping, so we can show that part as well. We will select a virtual machine. Again, destination, we choose the cloud host. We will pick here our organization VDC, and it will resolve some default settings, like it will have a VApp and it will automatically create also this VApp, and it will specify the storage policy, but you can pick another one. It will just go for the defaults instead. Again, source mapping. We want to specify the networks that we have at the customer side. There we go. And we want to map this to the one we created in the service provider VDC. So this is the web servers There we go. So then again, the virtual machine will be updated correctly and mapped to that network. Next, finish, and the job is good to go. Now, don't forget, for partial failover, you can start the virtual machine straight from here. For full site failover, we need to create a failover plan in advance. So if we create it, all we need to do here is set the virtual machines that we want to launch, and that's it, because all the port forwarding, all the NAT rules, they were created in vCloud Director on the edges already, right? So here we just add the virtual machine, and that is it. So this concludes this demo. Let's hope that this was interesting for you, and thank you very much. Bye bye.